Open your Bibles with me, if you would, to the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel. We'll be in chapter 8. And we'll enter into a few things tonight that even the best of scholars aren't completely settled on. But what I'll keep trying to do is bring to you the obvious portions of it and make good applications and conclusions of that which is clear. We've seen God is an amazing author of the entire Bible as He fits the various authors together in the various books that are written over many centuries, several centuries. And what He has been doing, God has been doing as the author of this book in the book of Daniel, He's been revealing the times of the Gentiles. He's been giving Daniel a front row seat, and He's doing it layer by layer. He introduces the idea in more general terms in chapter 2 with Nebuchadnezzar's, the image of that Nebuchadnezzar saw, and how that Daniel was able to tell him that Nebuchadnezzar was represented by the head of that image, the head of gold. And the Babylonian Empire still had a lot of time left, or relatively amount of time left in it. You'll notice in chapter 8 the Babylonian Empire is not mentioned at all, other than the fact that it's still there in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar. So, as the images unfold, the second layer of Daniel's revelation had to do with the beasts, the kingdoms that were represented by the beasts. And that's, I think, so fitting that God sees the kingdoms of men as beastly things, where men look at them as marvelous and wonderful things. But it's beastly in God's view, because it's one beast devouring another beast, devouring another beast. And that's what took place, and that's what primarily does take place in human history. And so the second layer of Daniel's revelation, the revelation given to Daniel, was the chapter 7, the four beasts. And we saw how the consecutive kingdoms played out in that. Chapter 8 represents the third layer, the third installment of revelation to Daniel, and what was recorded then for us. And it's now, as I say, so very near the end of the Babylonian Empire that it's not even mentioned. It goes right into the ram. Remember verses 5 through 7 and in Daniel chapter 8. And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes, and he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran into him in the fury of his power. And I saw him close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram. So the ram was there, and the goat smote the ram, and the Medo-Persian Empire and that's developed in verse 20. The ram which thou sawest having two horns are the two kings of the Media-Persia Empire. And so the two horns, remember, one was higher than the other, and the Medo-Persian Empire was in two entities that came together, the Persian entity being larger and stronger, and that was represented by the ram. And then verses 20 and 21, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia. And so we've identified him, and history makes this point that's irrefutable, that Alexander the Great emerged and began to conquer everything in his sight. And at 33 years old, some say 32, but at a very young age and very suddenly, he died. and not having, not being old and preparing for death, was not prepared in the sense of having his generals ready for all this, or having a successor to the throne ready for all this. So the four key generals got together and divided up the kingdom, the empire. And so that is where we left off last week, that the ram is where this vision started, verse 20, is the Medo-Persian Empire. And the rough goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn that is between his eyes, I'm in verse 21, the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. And remember, it was a notable horn. It was noteworthy. It was odd and got Daniel's attention. Now, verse 22 will bear in on tonight. Now that being broken, that horn between its eyes being broken, whereas four stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. And you don't have to wonder what verse 22 means, because historically we can see how it played out. Historically we can see how it was fulfilled. Alexander the Great mowed over everything in his path, and then he died, and then the 4 generals assumed the empire, dividing it into 4 portions. But he ends verse 22 by saying, not in his power. So we're dealing with the times of the Gentiles. And that is where we left off last week. So we begin then in verse 9 tonight. And 9 is where, 5, 6, 7, 8, right in there is where Daniel saw the visions, and then 20 through 21 is where he had it interpreted. So now we're going back to more of what Daniel saw when we go back to Daniel 9, or verse 9. And out of one of them came forth a little horn. So in verse 8, I should read verse 8. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. And so now you have the 4 generals and the 4 portions of Alexander's empire. And out of one of them, and it was Seleucus, out of one of them came forth a little horn. Well, right away you kind of say, oh, the little horn, we met him. Well, yes and no. This little horn, in fact, the Hebrew words used for little horn here and used for little horn in chapter 7, I believe it was verse 8, they're slightly different Hebrew words. And I'll be honest, I was unable to discern why, because the Hebrew words ultimately mean basically the same thing. But the author did use, God did reveal it in language that used different words. He's not talking about exactly the same thing as the little horn of verse 8 of chapter 7. So is it the same? Yes and no. I believe the little horn here will develop nicely in this text, and I think history to us, not history to Daniel, history to us will bear out that this little horn in chapter 8 is a type of the little horn. The little horn in chapter 7 develops out very, very easily, I think, very comfortably with being the Antichrist. And this one will develop out to be a type of a human picture by a beastly individual that will show forth as a type of the Antichrist. So out of one of them came forth a little horn. Out of one of those 4 portions of the empire that were governed by his 4 main generals came forth a little horn. And they start little, but what does it say? Which waxed exceeding great. And we're talking roughly 148 years of development from the time of Alexander the Great's death to this fulfillment of verse 9, this little horn, which will be Antiochus Epiphanes, a literal person that history is well aware of. And I believe that is the reference of this little horn. We'll develop this. We'll look at this together in verse 9. And out of one of them came forth a little horn which waxed exceeding great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land. So this one that waxed exceeding great, that came up out of one of the four generals' portions of the empire, the one noteworthy individual, the main and the most noteworthy individual, is probably Antiochus Epiphanes. He self-named himself that, the epiphany of the heavens. Even when you look in Wikipedia, you just Google Antiochus Epiphanes and look into Wikipedia, in quotations after his name, Antiochus Epiphanes, it says, God among us, or God manifest. God manifest. He thought he was, apparently, a god, and named himself Antiochus Epiphanes, the epiphany of God, the revelation of God. Or, as Wikipedia puts it, the manifestation of God. And it all went to his head. And what Antiochus Epiphanes had that is well documented by many resources, including many of the Jewish historians like Maccabees and Josephus, even Wikipedia and the secular histories will document Antiochus Epiphanes' hatred for the Jew, hatred for the people of God, hatred for Jerusalem. The stories that I read of the grotesque ways that he devised to torture people and then kill them, and to do so in unspeakable ways. I won't even let, if you're interested, you read it. I won't even repeat it. It was awful, and he would do these unspeakable things in ways to torture people in front of their families and stuff, and then kill them. He hated the Jews. He hated the temple. He desecrated the temple. Obviously, they were not to even eat pork, and he brought a pig into the temple and offered it on the altars and made the priests to eat the flesh. And it was just horrendous, this man's hatred for the Jew and his desire to ruin and destroy and overturn Jerusalem and desecrate the temple and kill the people of God. If you Google Antiochus Epiphanes, you will quickly see from many resources, and not just Jewish historians, like I say, Maccabees and Josephus, not just there, but in secular history. It was a fact that nobody could work around. This guy hated God's people. And he came, I believe that it is him, and I believe that he will develop out in this text and in history as a type of the Antichrist. And so he is and he isn't the same as the little horn in the previous chapter. Remember, and I meant to bring this up sooner, that by this time, Nehemiah had led the effort to rebuild Jerusalem and fortify the city and reestablish appropriate worship in the temple and so on. And Antiochus Epiphanes, he just undid all of it. It was just a horrendous time period And we'll see in the text that it was still part of the judgment of God. It was still, I mean, the bottom line is God allowed it. And He doesn't allow anything or cause anything to happen without a purpose. And I think it'll indicate in the text that His purpose was more judgment of the unfaithfulness of the people of God. Verse 10, and it, that little horn referenced in verse 9 that waxed great, it waxed great even to the host of heaven. Now, the host of heaven is a term that we run into in Genesis several times, that it relates to the people of God. Genesis chapter 15. Genesis chapter 15 and verse 5. Well, maybe I didn't. And he brought him forth abroad and said, Look now toward the heaven, and tell the stars if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. Your seed will be like the stars in the host of heaven. And also in chapter 22 and verse 17. Chapter 22 and verse 17. That in blessing, God's talking to Abraham after he was showing himself faithful to be willing to offer Isaac. That in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of heaven, stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. And so most understand this host of heaven, and because of the references in Genesis and other places, and because of the context, verse 10 of our text in Daniel, and it waxed great even to the host of heaven, even to God's people. And it, that horn, cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. And most take the host of heaven to be the people of God, and the stars to be the priests, the lights of the people of God, and stamp them upon the ground. The host of heaven, God's people, and the stars, God's priests, cast down to the ground and stamped upon them, which would absolutely fit with a picture of Antiochus Epiphanes' life. Verse 10, it waxed great and even to the host of heaven, and cast down some of the host of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. And I believe that's figurative and literal as you get into the way that Antiochus Epiphanes treated God's people. and stamped them down figuratively in the sense of destroying them, in the sense of destroying their temple, destroying them as a people. And I noticed that he waxed great even to the host of heaven. Even no matter how you read that, whether you see it as them seeing him as a good thing, and probably some bought in. Some of God's, I don't believe those that are saved of God's people, but some of God's people that were merely God's people by birth, the people of Israel, were so prone so many times to follow after false gods, to follow after the pagan religions of the world. And that he waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host. Did he wax great in their eyes literally, or did he wax great in their eyes and that was a bad thing in their eyes that he waxed great? Either way, this little horn Antiochus Epiphanes, grew in power, grew in ability to create havoc and harm and destruction of the temple. Yea, verse 11, he magnified himself. Now, that language is figurative of Satan himself. That language is figurative of the Antichrist in the book of Revelation as we studied him, where he magnifies himself. He believes himself to be all that he says he is. And he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. So here the context continues to fit really well with the host of heaven being God's people and the prince of their host, Jehovah. And he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. And in fact, that phrase is used in verse 25, or that word is used right at the end, that almost to the last phrase there. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes. And you'll notice that's capitalized, and very consistently Bible scholars take that to be Jehovah, the prince of princes. And so we find that he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. And by him, by the little horn that waxed exceeding great, I believe was Antiochus Epiphanes, by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And he did those things. He did stop proper worship in the tabernacle, or the temple. He did stop proper usage of the temple in general. He looted it. He took much of it. He destroyed much of it. He desecrated much of it. And so by him, the daily sacrifice was taken away. The place of his sanctuary was cast down. Verse 12, and a host was given him. Now again, was this host given him? Had they given their hearts to him? Did God allow that? Or did he overthrow and destroy them? At any rate, a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression. So many were moved against the proper daily sacrifice. Many were either conquered by him and moved in that direction, or were duped by him and moved in that direction. Many were moved in the direction of being opposed to the daily sacrifice, against the daily sacrifice. And what's the reason for all that? By reason of transgression. It would seem as though judgment, this is still the judgment of God. And it, this horn, Antiochus Epiphanes, and it cast down the truth to the ground. And again, figuratively and literally, he would have taken the law of God and done anything he could do to destroy it. And figuratively, trampling on the truth, trying to reassert different religious activities, trying to reassert himself as God, trying to overthrow the people of God. You can, and if you take just a few minutes and read about him in history, it fits very well with what he did to the Jewish people, what he did in the temple, and how he desecrated it. And a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced This is scary. And it practiced and prospered. God allowed this for a season, and that's going to be dealt with in a minute. God allowed this for a season to prosper. God allowed him to either conquer people or have a following of people on their own. Either way, God allowed him and his way of thinking and his treatment of the temple for a while to prosper. And it would seem like because of transgression. Verse 12, by reason of transgression. And many times in the history of the Jewish people, by reason of transgression, they were in bondage, and various different empires took them over, and they were in captivity to them, and so on and so on. And we will see we have seen in Revelation the Antichrist developed as one who God gives at first a lot of latitude, gives him a lot of rope. And it would seem like he's having his way with religious activity. He's having his way with God's people, destroying who he wants and whoever won't bow to him, and so on. And Antiochus Epiphanes seems to be a microcosm, small illustration of the Antichrist in Revelation chapter 12, 13, up in there. In fact, let's read Revelation 13, 4 through 8. Revelation 13, 4 through 8. Remember, the dragon in this text was the Antichrist. We made that point. I think we developed it pretty definitively when we were studying Revelation. So when we read the dragon here, we're talking about the Antichrist. And they worshiped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. And, I'm sorry, the beast was the Antichrist. Dragon was Satan himself. I stated it wrong. I'll get it straight. We found the dragon in verse 12 to be Satan. Gave power to the beast being Antichrist. And they worshiped the beast, saying, "Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. The Antichrist was speaking great things against God and blasphemies. And power was given unto him to continue 40 and 2 months. Remember, he was enabled by God, allowed by God, to have what would seem like all power for 40 and 2 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints, and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him. That is, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And Antiochus Epiphanes, in a small picture in his day and in that temple, in that Jerusalem of that day, lived up to a lot of what's going on in Revelation 13, 4 through 8. And so, back in Daniel chapter 8, let's read it again, not having it all broken up. Verse 9, where we started our text for tonight's study. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great, toward the south, toward the east, toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great, even to the host of heaven. And it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down, and an host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression. And it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. And that's where we left off. We wouldn't have the opportunity to be so definitive about Antiochus Epiphanes being the fulfillment of this little horn, except for history makes it pretty clear. We can look back and see who it was that developed out of one of the four general empires that came out of Alexander the Great's reign. We can look back and see who developed as this madman, as this beast, and it was Antiochus. Verse 13 of our text, and I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? How long is this going to go on? Now, think about Daniel. Think about the position Daniel's in. He's nearing the end of a 70-year captivity. He's almost seeing the light of day at the end of it, and he's already now reading about a new time period that is arguably every bit as bad, if not worse. I mean, it kind of bursts your bubble. Think about Daniel a little bit as he hears this. And he observes this in verse 13. He says, How long is the sanctuary and the host going to be trodden underfoot? And he said unto me, 2,300 days. Then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. A lot of people get into a lot of numbers. It's 2,300 days. There's no question about that. There's no question in my mind that it's 2,300 days and nights. I mean, it's 24-hour time periods. Then people begin to say, well, it starts here and ends here, starts here and ends there. That doesn't concern me. The exact day, some of the authors will pick a month and a day and a year, and that doesn't concern me. What concerns me is that God said it's going to last this long. What concerns me is, or what I'm concerned with understanding and relaying to you, is that God said this long, and it's over. I'm in control, not the little horn. I'm in control, not Antiochus Epiphanes. I'm in control, not Alexander the Great, not his four generals, not the one that flows out of his four generals. I'm in control, says God. And this time period, by the way, 2,300 days is roughly 6 1/3 years. I'm in control. I set, says God, when this is over. And that, I believe, is the takeaway. To get down into the weeds about it started here and ended here, started here and ended there, there may be some value in that, but what I do know is it ended. Because God said it would. God said in roughly 6 1/3 years, 2,300 days, it's going to be over. There's light at the end of the tunnel. And it didn't take 70 years, it took 6 years and a third, roughly. The years were marked in this time period as 360 days a year, not like ours, 365. So the takeaway of verse 14 to me is, God says, I'm in control. This will only last as long as I say it's going to last. And that is something we can take hope in. And if you want to dig into the weeds and figure out where that time period started and where that time period ended, you know, it's fun study. It's an interesting study. But what I wanted to impress is that God's in control. As Antiochus stands up and makes himself known, as he waxes great, God's in control. As he begins to torture, literally, Jewish people in mass, God's in control. As he begins to desecrate the temple and just make a horrendous mockery of it, God's in control. He hasn't lost control. I don't always understand everything about what he's doing, but he is in control. And he does allow certain things for certain reasons. And many times he allows these things, as I've said already, as a judgment for our unfaithfulness, our disobedience. But God has never once lost control of his creation. And he didn't lose control under Antiochus Epiphanes, who serves as a type of the Antichrist. He didn't lose control there, or won't lose control there either. There will be a time of terror and seemingly unstoppable reign. But ultimately, God draws a line and says, "This, you're done. Your time's up." And he wins the war. As the songwriter said, you can read the back of the book. God wins. As the college students were debating in a college gymnasium the finer points of Revelation and getting down into the weeds of all the different minutiae and details of Revelation and who's what and what represents this and that. And as the story goes, the janitor sweeping the floor says, "You guys, you're making too much out of this. I know exactly what Revelation tells us. God wins. Don't forget that. God wins." Let's stand.